I'll never forget the moment the neurologist said those words. My son was sitting on the examination table, stacking blocks with an intensity I'd never seen in any other child. And she looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't pity. It wasn't concern. It was something else entirely. And in that moment, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my family, about my child, about myself as a mother, was about to shift in ways I couldn't possibly imagine. We lived in a small suburban town where everyone knew everyone, the kind of place where neighbors still brought casseroles when you had a baby, where kids played in the streets until the streetlights came on. My husband Marcus and I had moved there 3 years before our son Ethan was born, drawn by the promise of a quiet life, good schools, and the kind of community we'd both grown up missing. Marcus worked as an accountant at a firm downtown. Dependable, methodical, the kind of man who color-coded his calendar and never missed a deadline. I was a part-time graphic designer, working from home, which was perfect when Ethan came along. My mother-in-law, Patricia, lived just 10 minutes away. She was the matriarch of the family, the kind of woman who had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. She'd raised 4 boys on her own after my father-in-law passed away when Marcus was just 12, and she wore that badge with fierce pride. Ethan was our first child. A miracle, really, after 2 years of trying and 1 heartbreaking miscarriage. When he was born, with his shock of dark hair and those enormous blue eyes, I remember thinking that nothing in my life had ever felt so right, so complete. Marcus cried when they placed him in his arms. Patricia called him her little prince from day one. For the first year, everything seemed perfect. Ethan was a quiet baby, content to lie in his crib and stare at the mobile spinning above him for hours. He rarely cried. He slept through the night at 8 weeks. All my friends with babies were exhausted, frazzled, barely keeping it together. And I felt almost guilty about how easy it all seemed. The first time I felt that flutter of worry was at Ethan's first birthday party. Patricia had gone all out, decorating our backyard with balloons and streamers, inviting all the neighborhood kids and their parents. There must have been 20 people there, all singing happy birthday, and Ethan just sat in his high chair, staring past everyone, fixated on a reflection of light bouncing off someone's watch. One of the other mothers, Sarah, touched my arm gently. Is he always this calm? I laughed it off. He's just taking it all in. Aren't you, buddy? But Ethan didn't respond, didn't even look at me. A few weeks later, Marcus came home from work and found me in the living room, calling Ethan's name over and over. Our son was sitting 3 feet away playing with his toy train, running it back and forth on the same section of track, completely absorbed. Ethan. Ethan, look at Mommy. Ethan. Nothing, Marcus set down his briefcase. How long have you been doing this? 10 minutes, maybe more, my voice cracked. He won't look at me, Marcus. He won't respond to his name. My husband walked over and clapped his hands sharply. Ethan, startled, looked up briefly, then went back to his train. See, Marcus said, his tone too bright, too reassuring. He can hear. He's just focused. You know how kids get when they're playing. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him so badly, but that night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, remembering all the little things I'd been brushing aside. The way Ethan never pointed at things he wanted. How he'd never said mama or dada, even though he was 15 months old. And all the parenting books said he should have at least a few words by now. The way he'd line up his toys in perfect rows, instead of actually playing with them. Patricia noticed too, though she'd never say it outright. She'd make little comments. Marcus was talking in full sentences by 18 months, or maybe he needs more stimulation. Have you tried playing music for him? Each comment felt like a tiny knife. At Ethan's 18-month checkup, I finally voiced my concerns to our pediatrician, Dr. Chen. I'd made a list on my phone, all the things that had been accumulating in my mind, keeping me awake at 3 in the morning. Dr. Chen listened carefully, nodding, taking notes. Then she did a series of simple tests. She called Ethan's name from different parts of the room. She tried to engage him with toys. She watched how he moved, how he interacted, how he responded to her voice. Finally, she sat down across from me, her expression gentle but serious. "I'd like to refer you to a specialist," she said. "A pediatric neurologist, Dr. Amanda Rodriguez. She's excellent." My hands went cold. "You think something's wrong?" "I think it's worth getting a professional evaluation. Some of the behaviors you're describing, combined with what I'm observing, could indicate a developmental concern. But I want you to know that early intervention, if needed, can make a tremendous difference." The word intervention echoed in my head all the way home. When I told Marcus, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Let's wait and see what the specialist says." No point in panicking yet, but I could see the fear in his eyes. I didn't tell Patricia. I couldn't bear the thought of her questions, her suggestions, her worry that would somehow morph into criticism of how I was raising her grandson. The appointment with Dr. Rodriguez was 3 weeks away. Those 3 weeks were torture. I watched Ethan constantly, cataloging every behavior, every quirk, every moment of disconnect. I fell down internet rabbit holes late at night, reading articles and forum posts that terrified me. I saw our entire future crumbling, saw my perfect, quiet boy struggling through a world that didn't understand him. Saw myself failing as a mother because I hadn't noticed sooner, hadn't acted sooner, hadn't somehow prevented whatever was happening. The morning of the appointment, I dressed Ethan in his favorite blue shirt with the dinosaurs. Marcus took the morning off work. We barely spoke on the drive to the hospital. Dr. Rodriguez's office was bright and cheerful, filled with toys and colorful posters. She was younger than I expected, with kind eyes and an easy smile. She spent over an hour with Ethan, playing with him, observing him, trying different ways to engage him. She had him stack blocks, look at pictures, follow simple commands. She watched how he moved, how he played, how he responded to sounds and voices. Marcus and I sat on a small couch in the corner, holding hands so tightly my fingers went numb. Finally, Dr. Rodriguez sat down with us, while Ethan played with a set of interlocking rings on the floor, completely absorbed in fitting them together in size order. "I want to start by saying that Ethan is a beautiful, healthy child," she began. "What I'm seeing today is consistent with autism spectrum disorder. Based on my evaluation and the history you've provided, I believe Ethan has what we call level 1 autism, sometimes referred to as high-functioning autism, though I prefer not to use that term because it can be misleading. The word autism hit me like a physical blow. I felt Marcus's hand tighten around mine. "But he doesn't look at us," I heard myself say. "He doesn't respond to his name. He doesn't talk. How is that high-functioning?" Dr. Rodriguez's expression remained calm, patient. "Let me explain something important. The fact that Ethan doesn't respond to his name isn't because he can't hear you or doesn't know his name. His brain processes sensory information differently. When you call his name, especially if he's engaged in something he finds interesting, his brain literally prioritizes the activity he's focused on over your voice. It's not defiance or inattention in the way we typically understand it. His neurological wiring makes it challenging for him to shift focus, especially from something that brings him comfort or fascination." I was crying now, though I hadn't realized I'd started. "So he knows we're calling him. He just can't respond? Or doesn't feel the need to respond in the way neurotypical children do? Think of it this way. Ethan's brain is like a computer running different software than yours. The hardware is fine. It's just processing information through different pathways. When he's focused on something, that focus is incredibly intense. It brings him joy and security. Interrupting that focus can actually be uncomfortable or even painful for him." Marcus spoke for the first time, his voice rough. "What about speech? Will he ever talk? Many children with autism develop speech, though it may be delayed. Others find alternative ways to communicate. The key is early intervention. Speech therapy, occupational therapy, behavioral therapy. There's so much we can do to support Ethan's development and help him thrive." "Thrive," I repeated. The word felt foreign. Dr. Rodriguez leaned forward. "I know this isn't the news you were hoping for, and I know it feels overwhelming right now. But I want you to understand something crucial. Autism isn't a tragedy. It's a different way of being in the world. Ethan isn't broken. He doesn't need to be fixed. He needs to be understood, supported, and given the tools to communicate and navigate a world that isn't designed for the way his brain works. She paused, then said something that I would replay in my mind thousands of times over the years that followed. Your son doesn't respond to his name the way typical children do. But here's what I observed today. When you walked across the room to get your purse, Ethan's eyes followed you. When your husband shifted in his seat, Ethan glanced over. When I changed the tone of my voice, he noticed. He's aware of you. He's connected to you. He just shows it differently. And your job, as his parents, is to learn his language instead of only expecting him to learn yours. The drive home was silent. Marcus gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. Ethan sat in his car seat, gazing out the window at the passing trees. Content in his own world. That night, after we'd put Ethan to bed, Marcus and I sat at the kitchen table with cups of tea neither of us drank. We have to tell my mother, Marcus said finally. My stomach dropped. Can we wait just a little while until we process this ourselves? She'll know something's wrong. She always knows. He was right, of course. Patricia had an almost supernatural ability to sense when something was off with her sons. We told her 3 days later. I'd rehearsed what I would say, how I would frame it, how I would forestall her questions and concerns. But the moment we sat down in her living room, everything I'd planned evaporated. Marcus just said it straight out. Mom, Ethan has autism. Patricia set down her coffee cup very carefully. Her face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Shock, disbelief, denial, and then something harder to read. Autism, she repeated. How do they know? He's not even 2 years old. Can they really diagnose that in someone so young? I explained what Dr. Rodriguez had told us about the evaluation, the criteria, the early signs. Patricia listened, her lips pressed into a thin line. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, what does this mean for his future? Will he be able to go to regular school? Will he be able to take care of himself? Get married? Have a normal life? We don't know yet, Marcus said. It's too early to say. But the doctor said with early intervention. I started. Intervention, Patricia interrupted. Therapy. Special programs. This is going to cost a fortune. And who's going to take him to all these appointments? You work, Marcus. And you... She looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes that made my chest tighten. You work from home, but you have deadlines, projects. How are you going to manage all of this? We'll figure it out, I said, hearing the defensive edge in my voice. Of course you will. You're his parents. You don't have a choice. She stood up, walked to the window, stared out at her garden. I just never imagined. When he was born, he was so perfect, so beautiful. And now, he's still perfect, I said, my voice harder than I intended. He's still beautiful. He's still Ethan. He's still your grandson. Patricia turned to look at me, and I saw tears in her eyes. I know that. Of course I know that. I need time to process this, to understand what it means. We left shortly after, the conversation feeling unfinished, unsatisfying. In the car, Marcus said, she'll come around. She just needs time. But I wondered if I would come around, if I would ever stop feeling like I'd failed somehow, like I should have known sooner, done something differently, prevented this somehow, even though I knew, logically, that autism wasn't caused by anything I did or didn't do. The next few months were a blur of appointments and evaluations. Speech therapy twice a week, occupational therapy once a week, a special education evaluation through the state's early intervention program. Each appointment meant forms to fill out, behaviors to document, questions to answer about milestones and development and family history. I quit my graphic design work. I couldn't focus, couldn't meet deadlines, couldn't bring myself to care about logo designs and brand identity packages when my son was struggling to stack blocks and make eye contact. Marcus threw himself into research. He came home from work with printouts from medical journals, articles about new therapies, dietary interventions, sensory integration techniques. Our kitchen table became command central, covered with schedules and therapy notes and insurance documents. Patricia visited less frequently. When she did come over, she watched Ethan with this expression I couldn't quite decipher. Sadness, maybe, or disappointment, or grief for the grandson, she'd imagined. The one who would play catch with her in the backyard and tell her about his day at preschool and grow up to be like his father. Steady and successful and normal. One evening, about 6 months after the diagnosis, I was giving Ethan a bath. He loved water, would sit in the tub for hours if I let him, running his hands through it, watching the ripples, completely transfixed. I was washing his hair, and I said softly, not really expecting a response, "I love you, Ethan, you know that, right? I love you so much." And he looked at me, direct eye contact, just for a moment. And he smiled. It was such a small thing. A look, a smile. But I burst into tears right there in the bathroom, overwhelmed by a rush of love and grief and hope all tangled together. That night, after Ethan was asleep, I called my sister Rachel. We'd always been close, but I'd been pulling away from everyone since the diagnosis, unable to articulate what I was feeling, unable to bear the well-meaning platitudes and the awkward silences. "I don't know how to do this," I told her, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to be the mother he needs. Everyone keeps talking about interventions and therapies and strategies, and I just want to know my son. I want to understand what he's thinking, what he's feeling. I want to know if he loves me." Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you remember when we were kids and I went through that phase where I wouldn't talk to anyone? After Dad left?" I did remember. Rachel had been 10, and she'd gone almost silent for months, communicating in whispers and notes, driving our mother crazy with worry. "Mom kept taking me to therapists," Rachel continued, "trying to figure out what was wrong with me, how to fix me. And then one day Grandma came to visit. You remember Grandma? Of course. She took me out for ice cream, just the two of us. And she didn't ask me questions or try to get me to talk. She just sat with me. And then she said, 'You know, Rachel, you don't have to talk to anyone if you don't want to. Your silence is yours, but I want you to know that I'm here whenever you're ready. And I'll listen to whatever you want to say, whenever you want to say it.' And that was it. She didn't push. She didn't try to fix me. She just accepted me exactly as I was in that moment." "What's your point?" I asked, though I thought I knew. "My point is that maybe Ethan doesn't need you to fix him or understand him completely. Maybe he just needs you to accept him, to be with him, to meet him where he is, instead of where you think he should be." After we hung up, I went into Ethan's room and watched him sleep. His face was peaceful, his breathing steady. I thought about all the ways I'd been trying to change him, normalize him, make him fit into the world as I understood it. And I realized that I'd been doing exactly what I'd accused Patricia of doing, mourning the child I'd expected instead of celebrating the child I had. The next morning, instead of rushing through our routine to get to speech therapy, I slowed down. I sat on the floor with Ethan and his toys. I didn't try to redirect his play or encourage him to do something different. I just watched, and I began to see patterns I'd never noticed before. The way he organized his blocks by color before stacking them. The way he'd tap each toy 3 times before moving to the next one. The way he'd line up his cars in very specific order. And if I moved one, he'd immediately put it back. It wasn't random. It wasn't meaningless. It was his way of making sense of the world, of creating order and predictability in an environment that must feel chaotic and overwhelming to his sensitive nervous system. At his speech therapy session that afternoon, I mentioned this to his therapist, Emma. She smiled. "You're starting to see his logic," she said. "That's huge. Most parents spend so long trying to impose their logic on their autistic children that they miss the opportunity to understand their child's perspective." "How do I learn more about his perspective?" I asked. "By watching. By being curious instead of corrective. By assuming that everything he does has a purpose, even if that purpose isn't immediately clear to you." I started keeping a journal. documenting not just Ethan's progress in therapy, but his interests, his patterns, his reactions. I wrote about the way he'd spin in circles when he was happy, the way he'd flap his hands when he was excited, the way he'd press his face against the window to feel the sun, the way he'd fall asleep only if I hummed the same song, the same way every single night. I began to see that these weren't behaviors to be eliminated or corrected. They were communication. They were joy. They were his way of experiencing and expressing himself in a world that felt too loud, too bright, too chaotic. Marcus and I started going to a support group for parents of autistic children. At first I resisted. I didn't want to sit in a circle and talk about my feelings with strangers. But Marcus insisted, and I reluctantly agreed. The first meeting, I sat in the back and barely spoke. But I listened. I heard other parents talk about their struggles, their fears, their small victories. I heard mothers cry about the milestones their children hadn't reached. I heard fathers talk about learning to communicate with sons who didn't use words. I heard stories of heartbreak and hope, of isolation and community, of grief and acceptance, and I realized I wasn't alone. One woman, Karen, had a daughter about Ethan's age. After the meeting, she approached me. "I saw you taking notes during the session," she said. "Are you a writer?" "No, I'm trying to understand my son. I'm documenting everything about him," Karen smiled. "That's beautiful. Can I tell you something? Something I wish someone had told me when Maya was first diagnosed. Please, stop waiting for him to become someone else. Stop waiting for the moment when everything clicks and he suddenly becomes the child you imagined. He already is exactly who he's meant to be, and the sooner you accept that, the sooner you'll be able to truly know him and love him for who he is, not who you wish he was." Her words hit me hard, because she was right. Some part of me was still waiting for Ethan to start talking, waiting for him to make friends, waiting for him to be interested in the things other kids his age were interested in, waiting for him to be easier, more typical, more normal. But what if he never did those things? What if he remained exactly as he was, processing the world through his unique neurological lens, communicating in his own way, finding joy in spinning and lining up toys and running his hands through water? Would I love him less? The answer, I realized with a rush of shame and clarity, was no. I would love him exactly the same, maybe even more because I would know him more fully. That night, I deleted all the articles I'd saved about curing autism, about interventions that promised to make children indistinguishable from their peers. I unsubscribed from the blogs that talked about autism as a tragedy, a burden, something to overcome. Instead, I started reading blogs written by autistic adults. I watched videos of autistic people explaining their experiences, their perspectives, their joys and struggles. I joined online communities where autistic individuals and their allies shared resources and support. And I learned that autism isn't something that happens to a person. It's a fundamental part of who they are. Their brain, their neurology, their entire way of perceiving and interacting with the world. Trying to eliminate Ethan's autism would be like trying to eliminate Ethan himself. Patricia came over one Saturday afternoon, about 9 months after the diagnosis. She'd been distant, visiting less frequently, always seeming uncomfortable around Ethan. I'd been hurt by it, but hadn't known how to address it. She sat at my kitchen table while Ethan played in the living room, lining up his toy trains with meticulous precision. "I owe you an apology," she said abruptly. I looked up from the coffee I was making, surprised. I've been a terrible grandmother these past months. I've been so caught up in my own feelings, my own disappointment, that I forgot what was important. Her eyes filled with tears. I was grieving, I think. Grieving the grandson I'd imagined, the one who would be like Marcus, who would grow up to be a doctor or a lawyer, who would give me great-grandchildren someday and carry on the family name. And in doing that, I was completely missing the grandson I actually have. She looked toward the living room where Ethan was playing, oblivious to our conversation. Last week, I was at the grocery store, and I saw a little boy having a complete meltdown. He was on the floor, screaming, inconsolable. His mother was trying everything and nothing was working. And people were staring, judging, making comments. And all I could think was, that could be Ethan someday. That could be you, dealing with that situation with all those judgmental eyes. And instead of feeling embarrassed or worried about what people might think, I felt angry. Angry at all those people for judging a mother and child they didn't know, for assuming the worst, instead of offering help or compassion. She wiped her eyes. That's when I realized I'd been one of those people. Not out loud, maybe. But in my heart, I'd been judging Ethan for not being what I expected. And I'd been judging you too, though I tried to hide it. Wondering if you'd done something during pregnancy, if you'd noticed the signs earlier, if you'd pushed for intervention sooner. As if any of that mattered. As if any of that was your fault. I was crying now too. I blamed myself for the longest time. I still do sometimes. Even though I know it's not rational, I know you do. And I'm sorry for making that worse. She reached across the table and took my hand. Tell me about him. Really tell me. Not about his appointments or his progress or his delays. Tell me about Ethan, what he loves, what makes him happy, who he is, and so I did. I told her about the way Ethan would watch light refract through a prism for hours, fascinated by the colors. About how he'd memorized the sequence of our entire morning routine and would get upset if anything happened out of order. About the way he'd recently started humming back when I hummed to him, perfect pitch, a tiny echo of my melody. I told her about the afternoon he'd carefully placed a flower in my hand, the first time he'd ever given me anything unprompted. About the way he'd lean his head against my shoulder when he was tired, seeking comfort in his own quiet way. About how his therapist said he was making remarkable progress in learning to communicate, even though he still wasn't using words. As I talked, I watched Patricia's expression shift. The grief was still there, but something else was emerging too. Recognition, maybe, acceptance, love. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "May I try something?" She went into the living room and sat down on the floor, a few feet from Ethan. She didn't try to touch him or talk to him. She just sat. After a few minutes, Ethan glanced at her. Then he went back to his trains. Patricia didn't move. She just stayed there, present but not demanding. Finally, after what must have been 10 minutes, Ethan picked up one of his trains and rolled it slowly across the floor toward her. Patricia looked at me, her expression questioning. I nodded. She picked up the train and rolled it back to him. Ethan took the train, placed it carefully back in his line, and then rolled a different one toward her. They continued like this for almost half an hour, this quiet exchange of trains across the carpet. No words, no expectations, just connection. When Patricia finally got up to leave, she hugged me tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for teaching me how to see him." After that day, Patricia became one of Ethan's biggest advocates. She went to support group meetings with us. She learned about sensory sensitivities and helped us identify triggers and accommodations. She started reading the same books and articles I was reading, educating herself about autism from autistic perspectives. She even came with me to an IEP meeting at Ethan's preschool, sitting beside me as we advocated for the supports he needed, refusing to accept the school's initial suggestions that would have placed him in a more restrictive environment than necessary. Marcus and I grew closer through all of this. Our relationship deepened by the shared experience of learning to parent in a way neither of us had expected. We had hard conversations about expectations and hopes and fears. We learned to celebrate milestones that wouldn't appear in any baby book. The day Ethan tolerated a haircut without crying. The day he let another child sit near him at speech therapy. The day he pointed to a toy he wanted, instead of trying to lead us to it by the hand. By the time Ethan turned 3, our life looked nothing like I'd imagined, but it was beautiful in ways I never could have anticipated. I'd learned to read Ethan's subtle communications, to recognize when he needed space and when he needed connection, to understand that his love language was different from mine, but no less profound. I'd learned that stimming wasn't something to suppress, but a healthy way for him to regulate his nervous system and express emotion. I'd learned that nonverbal didn't mean non-communicative, and that Ethan had so much to say if I just learned to listen in new ways. On Ethan's 3rd birthday, we had a small party, just family. Patricia came early to help set up. Marcus's brothers and their families came. Cousins Ethan mostly ignored, but who seemed fascinated by his intense focus and unusual play patterns. We didn't sing happy birthday. The sound overwhelmed Ethan. Instead, we let him explore his presence at his own pace while we talked quietly in the kitchen. Later, after everyone had left, I was cleaning up when I heard a sound from the living room. A voice, Ethan's voice. Train. I froze, my heart pounding. I walked slowly to the doorway. Ethan was holding up his favorite blue train, looking directly at Marcus. Train, he said again. Marcus's eyes met mine across the room, both of us crying. It was one word, just one word after 3 years of silence. But it was everything, not because it meant he was getting better or overcoming his autism, but because it was Ethan choosing to communicate in a way that felt safe and right for him. Because it was him bridging the gap between his world and ours, meeting us halfway. Over the following months, more words came, slowly, not in the typical progression. Sometimes he'd use a word once and not again for weeks. Sometimes he'd repeat the same word dozens of times in a row, delighting in the sound of it. But each word felt like a gift, a window into his mind. But the words weren't what changed our relationship. That had already changed long before he spoke. It changed when I stopped trying to fix him and started trying to understand him. When I stopped seeing his autism as something separate from who he was, and started seeing it as the lens through which he experienced everything, I learned that parenting Ethan meant becoming fluent in a different language. It meant learning that eye contact, while important in my culture and communication style, wasn't the measure of connection or attention. It meant understanding that his intense interests weren't obsessions to be redirected, but passions to be celebrated and leveraged for learning. It meant accepting that his path would be different, his milestones would be different, his entire experience of the world would be different from what I'd imagined, and that different wasn't less. It was just different. Dr. Rodriguez had been right. My job wasn't to make Ethan learn my language. It was to learn his one evening. When Ethan was 3.5, I was putting him to bed. He was lying under his weighted blanket, his eyes starting to droop. I hummed our bedtime song, the same one I'd hummed every night since he was born. When I finished, Ethan looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "Mama, not Mom, not Mommy, Mama." And then he reached up and touched my face, his hand soft against my cheek. It was the first time he'd ever initiated affection like that. The first time he'd used a term of endearment. The first time he'd touched me that way, gentle and deliberate and full of what I could only interpret as love. I sat there long after he fell asleep, his hand still resting against my face, tears streaming down my cheeks. This was what Patricia had been grieving. This was what I'd been grieving too, in those early months after the diagnosis. These moments of typical parent-child connection, the milestones we'd been told might never come. But they had come. Just differently, just on his timeline, just in his way, and they were sweeter for the waiting, sweeter for the uncertainty, sweeter because I'd learned to see them not as him becoming more like other children, but as him choosing to share his world with me. Looking back now, I can see how much I've changed, how much we've all changed. Marcus is gentler, more patient, more attuned to subtle communications. Patricia has become an advocate for autism acceptance in her own community, educating her friends and church members about neurodiversity. My relationship with my son is deeper and more authentic than any relationship I'd imagined having with a child who fit typical expectations, because I had to work to understand Ethan. I couldn't rely on cultural scripts or parenting, books or my own childhood experiences. I had to actually observe, listen, and learn who he was as an individual. And in doing that, I became a better parent, a better person, I learned that love isn't about someone meeting your expectations. It's about meeting them where they are and valuing them for exactly who they are. I learned that communication happens in countless ways beyond words. Through gestures, expressions, behaviors, presence, I learned that different doesn't mean deficient. That neurodiversity is exactly that, diversity, not disorder. I learned that the things we think of as normal are just common, not superior, and that there's extraordinary value in minds that work differently, that see patterns others miss, that experience the world with an intensity and authenticity that's rare and precious. Most importantly, I learned that Ethan doesn't respond to his name because his brain works differently. Not because he doesn't love me, not because he doesn't care, but because his neurological wiring prioritizes different information, processes sensory input in unique ways, and experiences the world through a completely valid but different perspective. And you know what? That's okay. More than okay. It's beautiful. So when that neurologist told me that Ethan didn't respond to his name, but that it wasn't what I thought, she was right. It wasn't a sign of something wrong. It was a sign of something different. And learning to embrace that difference, to celebrate it, to let go of my preconceptions and expectations, and simply be present with my son, exactly as he is, has been the greatest gift of my life. Today, Ethan is 5 years old. He's in a mainstream kindergarten with support services. He has a few words, uses some sign language, and is learning to use a communication device that lets him express complex thoughts he can't yet say aloud. He has one friend, a little girl named Sophie, who doesn't seem to mind that he doesn't play the way other kids do. They sit together at lunch, and sometimes they just exist side by side, and that's enough for both of them. He still lines up his toys. He still flaps his hands when he's excited. He still needs his specific routines and his weighted blanket and his noise-canceling headphones in loud environments. He's still Ethan, artistic and wonderful and wholly himself, and I wouldn't change him. Not for anything in the world, because the moment I stopped trying to change him was the moment I truly started to know him, and knowing him, understanding him, seeing the world through his eyes, even for brief moments, has expanded my capacity for love and patience and wonder in ways I never imagined possible. The name that changed everything wasn't the one I gave him at birth. It was the name that explained how his beautiful mind works, autism, and learning what that name truly meant, beyond the stereotypes and the fear, beyond the grief and the expectations, was the beginning of the most important journey of my life. Not a journey to fix or cure or normalize, but a journey to understand, accept, and celebrate. A journey to learn a new language. A journey to see the world differently. A journey to love without conditions. And you? Have you ever faced something that completely changed the way you saw your family, your child, or even yourself? Have you ever had to let go of who you thought someone should be in order to embrace who they actually are? Have you ever discovered that what you feared was actually the gateway to something beautiful? I'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments below, and if this story touched your heart, please subscribe. There are so many more real-life stories about family, love, challenges, and the unexpected ways we grow. Stories that remind us we're not alone in our struggles or our triumphs, because at the end of the day, that's what we all need, to know that someone else understands, that someone else has walked a similar path, that the challenges we face, the fears we carry, the love that drives us forward, are all part of being human. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here. And remember, sometimes the greatest love is found not in perfection, but in acceptance.